Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you may be. And I'd like to welcome you back to our fifth and final session of our conference, entitled Diplomacy, the COVID-19 Pandemic, and the New Emerging Diplomatic Landscape. For our final session, we now want to turn to an intentionally global perspective and consider the present and future of diplomacy in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. Our panelists include four individuals who have all distinguished themselves as both scholars and practitioners of diplomacy in high-stakes contexts, which have impacted broad cross-sections of our global population. It is truly an honor to welcome them all to this panel. Before I begin this session, I want to invite our audience members to post their questions for our speakers during our Q&A session via the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen, and you'll see it just to the right of the center at the bottom of our screen. I will pose these questions to our panelists following their presentations as time allows. So this brings us to our first panelist, and that would be Geoffrey Wiseman, a former diplomat and Foundation Program Officer who joins us today from Canberra, or actually joins us from tomorrow in Canberra. Geoffrey Wiseman is a former Australian diplomat serving in Stockholm, Hanoi, and Brussels, and as an advisor to the Australian Foreign Minister Gareth Evans. He has also worked in the Strategic Planning Unit of the Executive Office of the United Nations Secretary General, and as a Peace and Security Program Officer at the Ford Foundation. He is the author of Concepts of Non-Provocative Defense, Ideas and Practices in International Security, and the co-editor of Diplomacy in the Globalizing World, Theories and Practices, and the Diplomatic Corps as an Institution of International Society. Welcome to you, Jeff.
Thank you so much, David. I've unmuted and I take it that you can hear me. So first of all, David, I do want to thank you, Sarah and Leah and all of the colleagues at the Grade School for the organisation of this absolutely important and splendid conference. And I also want to say that I'm thoroughly delighted to meet my co-panelists, if virtually. I know of each of you, and it is a real pleasure for me to be sharing this panel with you. David did set for us 3 questions, and I want to address those systematically. And the very first question that David asked, and I've slightly changed the order of it, is what is diplomacy's most obviously, where is diplomacy most obviously failing so far with the pandemic? And how can diplomacy most positively affect the way we address it? So for me, I think there has been, from a diplomatic perspective, a 2-part failure. One is a belief in the idea that a global pandemic can be resolved by national means. And the second failure is a widespread unwillingness to appreciate the benefits of a coordinated international response. Let me just say a word or two about each one of these failures. So the first one is this ongoing belief in national solutions for basically all problems. Adam Roberts, an old colleague of mine, noted fairly recently that plague management since the 16th century has been a key part of statecraft. And Roberts says that tackling endemics is first and foremost a task for national governments. Now, historically, that sounds about right. However, the scale of the COVID pandemic in a globalized world strongly suggests to me that national solutions are simply not enough. What we've also seen in the last few months is that borders have been noticeably hardened under the pandemic, and the anarchic idea that every nation is in it, or is in this for themselves. And I think that approach is simply not working, with infection rates now rising in many countries. And there's a paradox involved in this national approach as well, and that is that something that the French strategist Francois Eisbourg has pointed out, and that is that COVID-19 has actually had some nation-splitting effects. In other words, the example that he gives is Madrid and Catalonia have clashed over which jurisdiction is in charge of confinement rules. problems. And we've seen extensive examples of this, I think, in the United States and certainly in Australia. The second failure that I would note is that this unwillingness to appreciate the benefits of a coordinated international response. Now, this varies from country to country, of course, but it is puzzling. And it does remind me of a point that Fiona McConnell made in a panel yesterday, where she said that there is a growing crisis of multilateralism internationally. Now, here are a couple of examples that struck me, and I'm very conscious of the fact that all of my co-panelists have a great deal of experience with the United Nations system. So my example just really come from, I guess, my perspective, which was really a non-proliferation and disarmament one primarily. But if we take the great powers, or the permanent 5 members of the UN Security Council to start with, they have been criticised on various grounds as being unwilling to act collectively. And for me, this is disappointing because the permanent 5 members do have special rights. They are permanent members. They wield the veto. And therefore, at the same time, they carry duties that include defining their interests, their national interests, in a way that takes account of the common good. That is a duty that I think is implicit in their permanent membership of the UN system. They have a stake, they have a management responsibility for the preservation of the international system as a whole. And again, if we drill down from the permanent 5 to China and the United States, 2 permanent members, they have spent far too much time, in my view, vindicating their own position during the COVID crisis, rather than looking for cooperation-based solutions. And that brings me to the World Health Organization. It's an organization that I don't know a great deal about, but it has been heavily criticized in the media for being too slow to act, too accommodating to China in the view of some. But my view on all of this, and I just put this to the co-panelists and participants, is that I think it's unfair to blame the UN as a whole. You can't just simply dismiss the UN as being right or wrong on any issue. You have to basically identify what part of the UN you're talking about. In this case, I think it might be the UN Security Council, it might be the Permanent 5. And as I've been saying, I do think that the Permanent 5, the great powers or the great responsibles, have a special moral duty to lead on this issue. They should not, cannot only consider citizens in their own country, they have to consider people worldwide. Now, as for the WHO itself, I suspect that it doesn't have real power to enforce health regulations. Its role is, as I understand it, consultative, supportive, and advisory, not executive in the true sense of the word. And so I think some of the criticisms of the WHO seem, to me, a bit unfair. And it certainly doesn't help in the middle of a global crisis of the one we've been witnessing for the United States to freeze funding for the WHO and to announce its withdrawal that would take effect, in theory, in July 2021. So again, I think my comments there set up my basic argument about what sort of things might be done to correct the current situation. But I'll leave those as implicit for the moment and move on, David, to your second question. And this is, what do the unique challenges and opportunities presented by the pandemic have to say about the future of diplomacy? And how does the diplomatic future that you envision, in this case me, connect to my work and what I'm doing now and what I might do in the future? Well, the first point I'd make here is that COVID-19's unique, once in a century challenge is that it is a fast-moving transnational and global challenge. And you might contrast it, I think, to climate change's arguably slow-moving global crisis. The COVID crisis is in fact exacerbated by the fact that people can't get together in person, face to face, to manage problems. And again, diplomacy places great store on face-to-face interaction, and I think this is particularly relevant to the crisis that we're facing at the moment. Now, another key challenge for me is the question of how the pandemic will impact the role of the sovereign state itself. And we heard quite a bit about the sovereign state and its importance in international relations in the first panel yesterday and the first panel today. And I think for centuries, diplomacy has been directly linked to the state. And we see this expressed in a number of statements that have been made this year by someone like Francois Heisbourg, who I mentioned earlier, the French strategist, who basically said, the pandemic has reinforced the power of the state. The state is the most traditional protector of society from outside threats. And so here you have this argument that the pandemic reinforces the role of the state, the nation state, if you like, the sovereign state, in international affairs and in solving this problem, and therefore subsequently other problems as well. And so you see evidence for this particular view in the increase in the consular work of Foreign Service officers who have been required to repatriate thousands and thousands of nationals who've been stranded abroad by the pandemic. Now, in contrast to that national solution approach, you have someone like John Eikenberry at Princeton University, who's argued in an article in Foreign Affairs, the title of which is "The Age of Contagion Demands More Internationalism, Not Less." And you see the thesis there. In other words, more international cooperation is required, and that is basically how we'll get through this problem. Now, my own approach is that we need to go beyond these two prescriptions: better national responses and more international cooperation. They're both obviously very, very important. But both are tied a bit too closely, in my view, to the sovereign state. And my prediction and my hope is that diplomacy's future landscape, moving on to the questions that David has asked us to contemplate, is that we will see a kind of a complex hybrid of state practice based on narrow conceptions of the national interest, if you like, and social practice based on wider conceptions of everyday relations and interests of groups and individuals. And so what I try to do in my own work, David, is to operationalize this dichotomy, state practice and social practice. And my research envisages what I'd call a trans-Westphalian moment, or opportunity, if you like, in which governmental and non-governmental actors, and those in between, think and act diplomatically. And my research envisages diplomacy as having four dimensions. Two of them are the traditional ones, the bilateral relationships that we know of, the multilateral institutions that operate around the world. And then two concepts that go beyond that for me are my polylateral notion, which is relations between state and non-state actors. And another concept that I'm adding to my mix is omnilateralism. That is to say, relations between non-state entities. And so for me, I see diplomacy as actually having four dimensions: bilateral, multilateral, polylateral, omnilateral. And it's the last two that I think engage most directly with the Grade School of Applied Diplomacy. But again, I don't want to give the impression that I am basically arguing that we only go for one or two of these dimensions. My take is that we need to develop and work on all four of them. They're not mutually exclusive, and I would say that the transprofessional idea, transprofessional skills are needed in all four of these dimensions of diplomacy that I work with at least. Now, the third question that David asked us to contemplate, and again, I'll mention the question, which is, what is the kind of diplomatic core that is needed now to most effectively respond to the challenges that we're currently facing? Now, there are two ways of defining what the diplomatic core is. It is synonymous with the Foreign Service for many people, especially in the United States. But for this particular discussion, I take the diplomatic core to mean the assemblage of embassies in a capital city or at an international headquarters city, New York, Geneva, Rome, Nairobi, for example. And my good colleague at University of Minnesota Duluth, Paul Sharp, and I see a historical trend away from the more exclusive diplomatic core idea of formal diplomatic missions in a capital city, and that history is moving more towards this inclusive idea of diplomatic communities or a diplomatic community. That would involve the formal core, but it would also involve a very wide array of entities and individuals that do diplomacy in so many different ways. Paul and I also think that the idea of a diplomatic community is more likely to take hold in consular cities rather than in capital cities. And I think this is something that's already in evidence in Chicago. And it's already been in evidence, I think, in the panels that we've had at this particular conference, Dave. So this conceptual shift from core to community, I think, recognizes reality, something again that was mentioned in the last panel. It opens the door more widely to a very inclusive notion of groups of people that I would categorize as security dilemma mitigators, problem solvers, bridge builders, relationship developers. They fit into this notion of a diplomatic community. And so all this brings me to my, in summary, conclusion is that international collaboration, cooperation of all kinds needs cooperation between governmental and non-governmental diplomatic actors.
Jeff, thank you so much for these observations. I think this really frames our discussion quite well and sets a foundation for our ongoing conversation here. So our next panelist I would like to introduce is Meritxell Relaño, who is the Deputy Director of Emergency Operations of UNICEF, and she joins us today from Geneva. Meritxell Relaño's current responsibilities include acting as UNICEF's liaison with the IASC Interagency Standing Committee, hosting UNICEF's Global Education, WASH, Nutrition Clusters, and the Child Protection Area of Responsibility, as well as guiding UNICEF's strategy on accountability to effective populations. At the same time, she is responsible also for managing her organization's relationship with NGOs and private sector actors to support humanitarian operations. She is the former UNICEF representative to Yemen, where she managed one of the most complex humanitarian operations in the world. Prior to Yemen, she was the UNICEF representative in Djibouti and the deputy representative in Gambia. Her postings have also included Mozambique, East Timor, Panama, and Colombia. Welcome to you, Meritxell.
Thank you so much, David, and thank you for the invitation to this panel. It's really an honor for me to be together with Mr. Wiseman, Mr. Bartoli, and Mr. Ertharin, who actually I met in Yemen in 2015-16. I was very impressed with her diplomatic skills. But you know, I'm very much in line with what Mr. Wiseman said, actually. We are in a situation where COVID is affecting all of us and is affecting beyond our borders, actually. And so, according to the Secretary General of the UN, this pandemic is more than a health crisis. It's an economic crisis, it's a humanitarian crisis, it's a security crisis, and it's a human rights crisis. And it has affected all of us as individuals, as families, as societies. It has highlighted the fragilities within and among nations. And so our response will involve remaking and reimagining the very structure of societies and the ways in which countries cooperate for the common good. So in the words of the Secretary General, coming out of this crisis will require a whole of society, whole of government, and whole of the world approach driven by compassion and solidarity. And I would add a diplomacy-based approach. So diplomacy is behind the three-point approach that the pandemic that the UN has put in place. I understand that the UN is an organization that does most of its work using diplomacy, and I would say that the staff members, all of us, we could be compared, could be part of the diplomatic corps or today. So today, let me talk a little bit more about the COVID diplomacy and some examples that will resonate with Mr. Wiseman when he was mentioning about WHO. So the UN response has three elements. One is the health response under the leadership of WHO, the humanitarian response under the leadership of OCHA, and a development response mostly under the leadership of UNDP and others. So the health response is for the first time a large-scale transnational tries to be coordinated, comprehensive response, and includes many elements from the mobilization to detect, test, isolate, and care for each case, quarantine the contacts, the control and the suppression of the transmission of the virus, the reduction of mortality by providing care to the affected, development of vaccines and medicines that can be delivered at scales, etc., etc. So the diplomatic efforts behind these elements are enormous, and because I'm working on this, I can confirm that. But I'm going to give you two examples where you can think that every person involved is a diplomat or is using diplomacy, and every step of all those negotiations have been a diplomatic challenge. Behind closed doors here in WHO, you can't imagine how people go up and down, etc. But let me focus on two examples. So the first one is the supply chain task force, and I'm sure that this will resonate very much with Ms. Ertharin because she was head of WFP. So this is a channel for countries, and this has been set up in this year actually. So this is a channel for countries to request the critical healthcare supplies. It was launched, the COVID-19 supply portal was launched in May 2020 and currently provides access to PPEs, biomedical equipment, diagnostic supplies, and is co-chaired by WHO and WFP, and it includes in this body, other than WHO and WFP, UNICEF, OCHA, the World Bank, the Global Fund, UNOPS, UNDP, UNFPA, UNHCR, NGOs, the Red Cross, etc., etc. So you can see already there the multiplicity of partners, and the work is divided in three elements. Let's say there is a task force that is the high-level supervisory body, and this convenes the key partners and provides strategic direction and guidance. Then there is a purchasing consortium. Actually, there are three of them. So they are the collaboration bodies, one for diagnostics, one for IPC and one for clinical management. And then they coordinate the demand, the procurement, and the allocation of those supplies to the countries. And then there is a control tower that does the day-to-day operation. And it's very interesting that those purchasing consortia, for example, they have been established for each of the product areas that I mentioned, and the membership in each of those consortia is different, but includes again WHO, UNICEF, UNDP, UNOPS, the World Bank, UNITAID, PAHO, Africa CDC, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, FIND, CHILD, this is the Clinton Foundation, DFID, PATH. So a multiplicity of actors, governmental, multilateral, private sector, foundations, etc. Their task is to do the technical specifications, they aggregate the demand forecast, source the supplies to meet the needs, guide allocations, etc., etc. And well, the control tower is where everything comes together. But basically what this group of people do is consolidate the demand of supplies of all the countries, coordinate the purchasing, and then make sure that distribution happens. Actually, this is with the support of WFP, UNICEF, and others. So this is one of the examples. The second example is the ACT accelerator. It's called Access to COVID Tools. And this accelerator, in the words of the UN, not being very modest, I would say that is a groundbreaking global collaboration initiative to accelerate the development, production, and access to test, treatment, and vaccines. So this was launched at the end of April 2020 at an event co-hosted by the WHO, the presidents of France, the president of the European Commission, again, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So can you imagine the behind doors diplomacy to make this happen? And this brings together government, scientists, businesses, civil society, philanthropists, etc., etc. So again, this is organized in 4 pillars, but I want to focus on one of the pillar that is the most interesting for me is the COVAX, the vaccine pillar. And within the ECT accelerator, the COVAX is co-led by Gavi, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovation, and WHO. And the idea is, of course, to accelerate the development and the manufacture of the COVID-19 vaccine, and how to guarantee a fair and equitable access for every country in the world. So this is a platform that supports the research, the development, the manufacturing of the vaccine, and negotiate their pricing. So all participating countries, regardless of their income levels, they will have equal access to these vaccines when they are developed. The initial idea is to produce 2 billion doses by the end of 2021, and mostly initially for high-risk and vulnerable people, as well as for frontline healthcare workers. And so how does it work? This facility, all countries put money into this, even the donors. The World Bank is also putting money into this. Countries with less funds, they put less money, or they are funded by ODA. So they invest in the manufacturing, this facility invests in the manufacturing of the vaccine, and is a shared risk approach. So far, 78 countries have already confirmed their participation in the facility. So I don't have more time to explain about COVAX, but I think it's a fine example of diplomacy and one of the successes of this global cooperation that goes a little bit beyond the traditional interpretation of diplomacy. So the fact that the international community has come to that far is really an achievement, I would say. Then, of course, there is the second pillar of the UN response is the humanitarian response. Here is where all agencies were working on providing immediate humanitarian assistance in terms of water and sanitation, hygiene services, nutrition, food, education, child protection, etc. Here is where we have a global humanitarian response plan, and most of the agencies, including UNICEF, is working. And the third pillar is the one on the recovery process, and a recovery process that the UN is calling build back better. I mean, leading to a more equal, inclusive, resilient, sustainable economies, an international system that can deliver on critical public goods, etc., etc. So I will not go into many of the details, but this is under the leadership of UNDP and DCO socioeconomic framework. I mentioned the work of UNICEF in all of this. Basically, within the health pillar, we are working on risk communication and community engagement, and very much involved in the supply element. And then on the second pillar, on the humanitarian, working on health, nutrition, gender-based violence, education, etc., etc. So on the questions of David, so how can diplomacy affect the way we address the pandemic? I think I've given two examples where the UN has really put their minds and their heads together with the private sectors and the government to develop a diplomacy approach that hopefully it will work. But you are seeing the number of actors that are involved there: UN agencies, governments, NGOs, other multilaterals such as Gavi, etc., etc. And so I would say that COVID, the same as climate change, as you mentioned, migration, obesity and malnutrition epidemics, and many other transnational challenges, they can only be addressed with a global solution if all countries cooperate for the containment, the treatment, the prevention. There is really no other solution, actually. And it's a pity that in the case of climate change, the countries didn't see really the urgency to work the same as they have seen the urgency to work around COVID, for example, setting up facilities like the COVAX or the supply distribution channels, etc., etc. So where is it failing? In one of the elements of this initiative of the Secretary General, I would say that is not really working so well. You will remember that the Secretary General called for a global ceasefire. This was issued on the 23rd of March, urging warring parties to pull back from hostilities. It has been endorsed by 180 countries and 20 armed movements, but actually I think war continues in many countries of the world, from Yemen to Syria to the Sahel, Cabo Delgado, Nagorno-Karabakh, etc., etc. But also, we still see huge diplomatic failure when there is food available in the world for everyone in the planet, and many children, they still go hungry to bed. Many children are dying from preventable causes such as diarrhea. So not everything is really a success. But anyway, I try to give you at least a couple of examples. So I see that the future of diplomacy in light of the pandemic is actually there. We had this unique opportunity to collaborate, for all those actors to collaborate. And I'll repeat what the Secretary General said. He said that coming out of this crisis will require a whole of society, whole of government, and whole of the world approach driven by compassion and solidarity. I think this is the only way forward, because those challenges really require the effort of many actors. I mean, only states will not be able to address them. We will need to work with the private sector, with the multilaterals, etc., etc. And then I also mentioned, I think, the kind of diplomatic course that is needed now to respond to those challenges. Well, I would like to say that now the diplomatic course is expanded beyond the traditional diplomats. I think that the UN and its agencies are staffed with professionals that conduct diplomatic efforts in the day-to-day routines, dealing with governments, with private funding agencies. We need to be well trained, and we need to be aware of our role. And sometimes we don't have all these full capacities. So it's important that we have more focused capacity building in those organizations, to understand that each of us, we are a piece of a bigger diplomacy machine, actually, with the examples that I've mentioned. And so I would say that there is a new cadre of diplomats that are contributing beyond the traditional the traditional approaches. So this would be, I think, my contribution to this panel. I hope it was useful. Thank you.
Meritxell, that was more than useful, and thank you so much for giving us such a detailed account of the work that you're involved in, and the so many layers of diplomacy that is being engaged right now. So with that in mind, I would like to turn now to our third panelist, Andrea Bartoli, the director of the Sant'Egidio Foundation, who joins us today from New York. Andrea Bartoli is the president of the Sant'Egidio Foundation for Peace and Dialogue, and its former UN representative. He is a member of the steering group of the Global Action Against Mass Atrocity Crimes and of the Global Steering Committee chaired by the United Nations Special Advisor on the Prevention of Genocide. Welcome to you, Andrea.
Great to be here. Thank you, David. Great to be part of this panel. I understand that it's going to be the last one of the conference. So in many ways, there is an interesting forward-looking energy, and I certainly appreciate the two previous panelists. I definitely find this conversation on transprofessional diplomacy very interesting and very appealing, because in many ways we see the world changing around us, and yet this desire to make sense of it, this desire to understand phenomena that are clearly bigger and larger than what we could conceive in the past. And this intuition of the Grey School that collaboration among governmental and non-governmental diplomats is actually a necessary component of these emerging structures. I think that the focus on COVID-19, the pandemic, and the emerging diplomatic landscape is also very interesting, because clearly we had pandemic in the past, not only the influenzas in the last century, but also HIV/AIDS. I think that it's a super interesting case of how the the collective consciousness became aware of itself through an experience that was shared in so many different ways across the globe, and it still is. We don't have a vaccine, we don't have a cure, we don't have a way to address those kind of challenges. And I think that it's important for us to remember those kind of learnings and experiences when that happened. I'm 63, I'm definitely in a generation that could remember HIV/AIDS very well. But certainly there is one element that I think it's important for all of us to really appreciate, that we are fundamentally in a system creation phase. We have been in a system creation phase for a long time. And what we see is that whatever we created, including the nation states, which was actually a relatively recent development in human affairs, is clearly changing, and it's changing in ways that are extraordinarily difficult and promising at the same time. So first of all, I would like to make a comment on transprofessional diplomacy from an epistemic point of view, from a linguistic point of view, because it seems to me that one of the challenges that we have is to find a language to describe the world as it is, rather than creating a caricature. So when we speak of a diplomat as somebody who is simply courteous, it's clearly a caricature of a function that is actually much older. All the language around diploma, this folded message that was shared as an official message among states is very old. Humanity started sending ambassadors very early on, because we know perfectly well that our way to cooperate is connected to our way to speak and to hear and to communicate properly, in a sense of reading and understanding what it is said to us, even when the message is intentionally deceiving. So the whole work on intelligence and the whole work on state apparatus goes in the direction of decoding messages and realities that other people may actually want to hide. So I think that it is very interesting what the transprofessional diplomacy effort, at least the way I'm welcoming it in a way, is this effort of saying, no, it is possible to make sense of life, of the world, of the system in which we are, what is happening to us. And the way in which this is going to work is the old-fashioned try to communicate, to probe what we are saying, to make sure that we understand what is truly happening. And in that sense, I think that this particular panel is very interesting, because I definitely hear the different perspective and this desire to create framework through which we can understand and help others to understand. But fundamentally, this primacy of understanding is very clear to me. And the primacy of language in the creation of the possibility for us to understand. I was speaking at the beginning in the informal talks about the positive step in South Sudan that just happened 2 days ago with the facilitation of the community of Sant'Egidio. And that is just a reminder of how the pandemic is actually intruding and affecting processes that are already extremely fragile in their own ground. South Sudan is the most recent country, is clearly trying to find its way, and is going through these processes of self-definition that will create the political landscape internally that would allow for decision to be made. So how is the COVID affecting, that particular setting? Well, in many ways, not only preventing people from moving, but they are preventing the capacity for the actors to speak about the possibility of them to speak. The constitutional process that is in place is clearly delayed. There are military and political questions that need to be addressed. But the fundamental issue is that every single person needs to encounter the pandemic taking into account her or his own subjectivity. And it's very different if you are a native of the Amazon, where you have a relatively small cultural reference around you, and the virus comes at you very heavily, killing the entire group around you. Or if you are in New York City, where the governor is clearly micromanaging everything that happens in your life. The capacity we have to understand the pandemic itself is very, very different. And of course, what we see is that this awareness is becoming clearer to us, not just as a challenge, but as an opportunity. In many ways, we see better now that there is an infinite number of possible steps that can be imagined, tried, verified by multiple actors. And the challenge is actually how to bring them together. We are all speaking English. I'm not an English-speaking person. I learned English when I was 35 and in a different context. Is English the only language we can make sense of the world? Of course not. You know, there are thousands of languages that needs to be spoken, and humanity must continue to speak thousands of languages. Actually, we are losing languages like crazy in these experiences of becoming one. And I feel that this attentiveness, not only to what was already differentiated, but to what is differentiating is fundamental. So in that sense, I really think that for us, if we look, for example, at what happened in the case of the community of Sant'Egidio that I represent, is quite remarkable. In Assisi in '86, there was this call from Pope John Paul II to religious leaders to have a moment of silence. And I think it's important for us to realize that in Assisi, people did not pray together. They simply went their different ways, the same way they usually do. You know, the Muslim went to a little mosque, and the Jews went to a synagogue, and the Christians in a church, and so on. And everybody prayed in their own way. But then they came together in a public square, silently, longing for peace. Well, Sant'Egidio started doing peace in Mozambique, in Kosovo, in Guatemala, most recently in South Sudan, because of that invitation. That was not a state invitation. That was the awareness that peace is actually a responsibility for all of us. And of course, when Geoffrey and the others started thinking about responsibility to protect and so on, this is not just a responsibility for the states. This is responsibility for us individually, contributing a frame, contributing an initiative, contributing this panel is a form of responsibility. So I think that what we see when we look at the world as it is happening is this need to be fully aware of our own responsibility in a non-relativist, responsible constructionist mode. We are fundamentally responsible for the history that we are living. We are clearly not inventing the viruses. We are surrounded by viruses all along, and there is a big debate on how this particular virus went into humans and all that, but there is no solution if we abdicate to the possibility of understanding and knowing. And the only way that we can truly understand and know is to do it together. And I really feel that what is emerging is very interesting. It's it's a remarkable moment. I can't help remember myself that in 2 days in Rome there will be a gathering of religious leaders with Pope Francis, again on that line of prayers for peace, and that Abraham, this man that was defined in scriptures as a friend of God, was a nomad, was somebody that didn't really have a house. A place was promised to him. Is clearly an important references for Jews, Muslim, and Christians. But I wonder, in human terms, how we can become one another this reference point, how we will be able to engage with one another in a way that will enhance the responsibility for the future. And this cannot be but through the personal responsibility of each of us engaging others, making sense, communicating to others, and moving groups and structures along with us. I'm delighted that you invited me to this panel, and I'm happy to participate in any other question we may have.
Thank you so much, Andrea. You've posed so many good questions and compelling ones that I hope we can carry into the rest of this panel and our conversation. I would like now to introduce our fourth and final panelist, Ertharin Cousin, who is a visiting scholar at the Center on Food Security and the Environment at Stanford University, and who joins us today from Chicago. Ambassador Ertharin Cousin was the 12th director of the World Food Program, the largest humanitarian organization on Earth, and the 2020 recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize. Prior to that post, Ertharin was the US ambassador to the UN agencies for food and agriculture in Rome. She is currently a distinguished fellow of global agriculture at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. And I am very pleased to say a member of the External Advisory Board of the Gray School of Applied Diplomacy. Welcome to you, Ertharin.
David, thank you so much for that very warm welcome. And let me appreciate Sarah as well for her support in making this panel happen. I am so honored to be here with these other panelists. I've sat here and taken copious notes from each of you as you've spoken. And as the final speaker, what it's required me to do is kind of throw away my remarks for today, because you have all made each of the points that I hope to deliver and express them much more eloquently than and cogently than I think I would have. But let me start by, first of all, before I get into those remarks, say to, and when in any audience that I've had the opportunity to stand before since the Nobel Prize Committee's announcement of WFP's award of this year's Nobel Peace Prize, that I am just peacock proud of the entire WFP team for the work that they perform every day, without thought of accolades or awards. And to have that work recognized by the Nobel Prize Committee. I was on an email chain with all of the other former American directors of the WFP, and it was just a celebration amongst all of us, because this is a shared honor with all of those people who have been part of WFP, both past and present. And then that takes me right into David. You asked, has diplomacy failed during COVID? And Meritxell spoke specifically about how this crisis began as a health crisis, but quickly evolved into an economic crisis, a health crisis, and a food crisis. And that food crisis, and as she noted, we produce enough food in the world. And even before COVID, we were in a situation where there were 690 million people who are undernourished or chronically hungry, which means that they're going to bed every night, not knowing where their next meal is going to come from. 144 million children stunted. And again, Meritxell spoke to some of this because of lack of access to nutrition during that first 1,000 days. 47 million children wasted, and which is a number that the international community celebrates because it's been flat and decreasing over the last several years. But the reality is, as she noted, if we acknowledge what wasting really means, the acute nature of malnutrition, then and accept the reality that in 2018 some 5.3 million children died before their 5th birthday, within too many cases related to that acute malnourishment. Those were the facts before COVID. With COVID and with the failure of the international community to embrace the opportunity for a ceasefire during this COVID pandemic, we have witnessed the number of those living on the verge of starvation increasing by some 130 million people, with a warning from the leadership of the international community, including my successor, David Beasley, that we now have about 265 million people living every day on the verge of dying from starvation. As a result of COVID, these are the people who live in the most vulnerable of circumstances, many of them living in conflict-affected places, where the need for support requires financial contributions from the international communities that to date have not yet been forthcoming, but also requires humanitarian access. One of the issues that we learned from experience in Yemen, Meritxell, I hope you will support this statement, is that having the right people, the right tools, the right resources, but not the access that is necessary because of conflict, limits your ability to provide that assistance where it's necessary to the people who require it. And when the international community fails to embrace the need for making the access available to humanitarians, even during a time of a pandemic, that's a humanitarian diplomatic failure completely. So I could spend a lot of time, and I have a lot more data on that one, but it's been covered by others talking specifically about the multilateral system and nationalism. But what I do want to do is I want to go back to a point that was made by both Geoffrey and myself around the WHO and their role in this work. And I'm not an apologist for the WHO, but I do believe that it's important that your audience understand that the UN system, the multilateral agencies, are as effective as the member states allowed them to be. And where each of the organizations is led by either by appointed UN officials, but supported by UN civil servants, but governed by member states. And the World Health Organization historically was a normative organization, not an operational organization. It has only been in the last 10 years that the international community has provided not just the governing authority to the World Health Organization to support their operational capacity, but invested the financial resources in the institution to support that internal capacity building. And so as much of these concerns were were articulated by many advocates in the health space after the Ebola crisis. There was a suggestion that we needed to reform and the operational capacity of the WHO. The WHO meets their requirements from a convening standpoint, from a normative standpoint, and it is only with the support from member states and advocates and stakeholders like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation that will drive the change that is necessary for the institution of the World Health Organization to continue to increase its capacity to perform. And so that, if you want to call it a failure, we share in that institutional failure of the World Health Organization because of lack of historical and even current support for the operational capacity of the organization. I feel the need to point out, and on that platform that Meritxell mentioned regarding the purchasing platform for the supplies, that again, that work began after Ebola between the WHO and the WFP. And I highlight that the importance of the fact that that work began after Ebola, because this is not the last international crisis, health crisis, that we will need to address. And so the institutional changes that are necessary, supported by the diplomatic activity of a variety of different actors, is necessary, not just for COVID, but to ensure that we have the systems and the institutions in place that will support the work that is necessary for us to better address the challenges that we as a global community will face as we move forward. When we talk about the challenges that we will face, it's also the opportunities that we face as a global, and I would say a global diplomatic corps, a diplomatic community. Not one of the panelists mentioned the Sustainable Development Goals. And I find that interesting, particularly because of the relationship that we all share to the United Nations and the shared commitment that we all made as a global community to addressing and achieving the 17 Sustainable Development Goals that we all agreed in 2015 when the Sustainable Development Goals were embraced by the international community in a record almost 15 minutes, that the peace and prosperity of the world was hinged upon our achievement of the SDGs and creating the support that was necessary across all of the multilateral system, as well as across our national governments, to support the work that was necessary to achieve those 17 goals. And so when we think about what failed, it was an abandonment of that shared commitment to international humanitarian prosperity. And Geoffrey spoke to this specifically on addressing the nationalistic posture that was taken by so many governments, too many governments, including my own, in the address of COVID, and the address of the COVID health challenges, and that's the spillover effect of that nationalistic address of the health challenges is now reflected in how we as a global community are addressing the economic and food security challenges that are beyond just the humanitarian issues that I've spoken to, but to the questions of build back better. Because building back better without a recommitment by the global community to the shared responsibility for achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, we've already set the roadmap for building back better. We don't need to create a new plan for what it will require for us to move forward in a manner that supports the ability of the international community to leave no one behind. A lot of work went into creating those Sustainable Development Goals. The question now is, are we willing to perform the diplomatic efforts that are necessary at every level to achieve, to drive the financial investment, the multi-sectoral cooperation, and the actual work that is required to move those commitments to reality. So the future landscape in light of all of this, and again, I'm going to speak as an American, okay? The US hegemony in the international system since World War II has been critical to the progress that we have made. I know many may disagree with that, but the data and the evidence of both our financial contribution, our diplomatic contribution, our military contributions would suggest the truth of that statement. It's interesting, the Pew organization conducted a poll recently that showed that only 22% of the 37 countries, the people in 37 countries that they interviewed, believe that our President Trump has the ability to do the right thing when it comes to international affairs. In that same survey though, 58% of that same poll population had a favorable impression of the American people. The road to building back better, achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, creating a global diplomatic climate that that moves us forward to achieving these objectives is directly related to the will of the American people. I could talk about voting here, but I won't now, move on. But because I think that I was on a panel yesterday with the good thing about Zoom is that you can go from country to country. I was on a panel in Germany where the German development minister talked about their work at the subnational level in the United States, working with mayors, working with governments, working with academia and institutions to support the implementation, the development and implementation of programs that are necessary to assist in the developing world, as well as in our own building back better. And that's a conversation for another day about our own food system in the United States. But so that work is happening at a level that where we as Americans are using diplomacy in its Oxford definition of working together and I'll just as a reminder, the art of dealing with people in a sensitive and an effective way to achieve a mutually shared goal. And that is happening. And that work, as we look forward, is quite critical to our ability to truly move beyond a saying of building back better to actually achieving the outcomes of what a building back better could mean, from not just the health systems, the food systems, but the economic and system, and the truly achieving the SDGs. So I'll go to the question of, how does the diplomatic future envision connect to the work that I am doing today? As I wear many hats on any particular day. Much of my work with both Stanford and the Chicago Council is directly related to advocacy and research around issues related to the achievement of a global food system that supports access to affordable, nutritious foods for everyone, a universal access to affordable, nutritious foods, including the poor and underserved. In Rwanda right now, my organization that I started, Food Systems for the Future, during COVID, we worked with the Minister of Agriculture to develop, and with funding from several charities, to support the business continuity of egg producers by purchasing eggs when the borders were closed and the markets were closed, that otherwise would have resulted in what we too often see in developing countries, and in fact we saw it here, the culling of livestock when there is no market for the product and the farmers can no longer afford the feed to maintain their flocks. And so we were able to purchase the eggs, giving the farmers income during the shelter in place in Rwanda. Those eggs were then distributed through the health department to families with children under 5, low income and families, vulnerable households with children under 5, to provide them with an animal-based protein, along with the grains that the government was able to procure and provide. We are now looking to scale that program up to create an affordable commercial egg enterprise that will provide access to the ability of even the most vulnerable to purchase what is considered a high-priced commodity today, an egg. You know, an egg in Rwanda would cost 60 cents in US dollars per egg. And even here in the United States, that for many households, that would make eggs a luxury commodity. How do we reduce that price in order to support it? And it requires private sector, public sector, working together to address that challenge. And so that is the space that I am in today. The question of building a diplomatic corps that reflects the global, my idea of global participation in addressing the most challenging issues in our world today, that requires, and I say global and not multilateral, because it's not just at the state level, it's multi-sectoral action that is required, and multi-sectoral action, including the multilateral institutions, the civil society, the private sector, academia, and working together at the international level to solve challenges, but also implementing together and sharing of ideas on policy development at the national level and implementation at the local level, that requires all of that multi-sectoral diplomatic activity in order to successfully achieve outcomes that are beyond any siloed response, that are broader and provide the ability to truly get at the systemic challenges that are affecting our ability to address more intransigent and structural issues that that result in the kind of outcomes that we see in a situation like COVID. A good example of that at the international level is the CFS today, the Committee on Food Security. When the Committee on Food Security was reorganized by the body that governs it in 2009, it was the first UN body to also include a private sector mechanism as well as a civil society mechanism that gave seats at the table, not just the ability to speak, but seats at the table for the private sector and for NGOs. And it is that type of action at the global level that is going to be ever more necessary for us to provide for the types of outcomes that are beyond just the silos of those who are representing their state governments. Let me close by saying that the one I want to embrace a comment that was made both by Geoffrey and Meritxell, that the recognition that what COVID has provided us is that the recognition that we can't build walls or borders that are high enough to keep out the maladies of the least of us. And so it forces us to recognize our shared humanity, and that not only do we need a broad range of actors, we need a broad set of tools in our diplomatic toolkit that go beyond the traditional tools that are used by diplomatic corps, like force and finance, to humanitarian diplomacy. And that needs to underscore the relationship building that we do across those multi-sector of actors that drive the trust building that is required for us to truly work together to address these challenges.
Ertharin, I want to thank you so much for bringing together so many vital strands of all of the presentations that have been made. And I just want to say, as an overall statement, I always describe myself as a militant optimist, and I have to say that every one of the presentations that I have heard here have only fortified my worldview. And so what I'd like to do now is to just lift up one thing that each of you has said, and that I think I want to use to frame this final question. And so, you know, Jeff, when you started to talk about the COVID-19 pandemic, you described it as a once-in-a-century challenge, and one that really unifies us and on so many levels and diminishes a lot of the distinctions that we might see between different groups. And Meritxell, you pointed out, I think, in some very specific and granular ways, the incredible alliances that are being made among private sector and public sector actors with regards to addressing COVID. But I think also there's no question that all of the elements that you mentioned speak to groups that are involved in a number of other incredible global challenges that we face. Andrea, I really loved what you said, that we are viewing right now, we are seeing the emergence of a collective consciousness through the COVID pandemic, and we are in fact in a system creation phase, which I think opens the door to so many possibilities. And then, Ertharin, there are two things that you said that really stood out for me, among many things that stood out for me. And first of all, you said that access is the problem that can negate even having the right people in place to do the right thing. And yet at the same time, I just love the fact that you brought this back to the work of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, because I agree with you wholeheartedly. The wheel does not need to be reimagined. The tools and the plan are there in front of us. And, you know, it made me think about just the idea that, you know, could this pandemic in fact be the pivotal opening that we are now being presented with to address the global ecological crisis in a far more comprehensive and muscular way than we've either ever envisioned or have ever been willing to engage. And so what I want to now do is just simply, with those ideas in mind, I want to take us back to that question that takes us to the heart of this entire conference. And so that is, in light of all of your observations, what do you believe are the next concrete steps that must be taken in order to deepen collaboration among governmental and non-governmental actors? And I would like to suggest that you guys address these questions in the order of your presentation. So if we might start with Jeff.
Thanks so much, David. Again, just a quick note of thanks to you and to all the panel. This has been a great learning experience for me, and I do want to thank you for that. Concrete suggestions. I think I had 4 very quick ones, which I'll just note. That a new US administration should continue funding and remain in the WHO as an active, constructive member. Number 2, I think the WHO, based on what we've heard today, is doing a lot to bring in multiple actors. And I hope scholars and practitioners, officials at the WHO, begin to tell their story more aggressively, because I think it's an interesting transprofessional story. My 3rd concrete suggestion would be an appeal to political leaders to depoliticize the issue. Avoid the blame game. Stop trying to win an election on the back of a virus. My 4th suggestion would be to echo a point that Andrea made, which is we should remind ourselves of our power as individuals. We all have individual agency and responsibility. We can become informed, we can make choices, and we should continue to do so as a part of this global humanitarian action. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Jeff.
Well, thank you so much. It has been really interesting. But to your last question, I think that the pandemic gives us the perfect excuse to cooperate, because either we work together or we will not be safe. And so I'm not sure, maybe it's too early to say if the mechanism that we have described today will remain once COVID is over, or if will be used for other similar global challenges or diseases that are also killing millions of people, malaria being one of them. Many children and people are dying of malaria, of pneumonia, of diarrhea. Those are the main killers of children in the world. So what if we had similar mechanisms for the vaccine against the malaria, or to redistribute food in the world, so that the WFP is not alone in this crusade, and there is a global alliance with private sector, with public sector to redistribute food in the world? What if we have the same for climate change? And in climate change, I think there is quite a lot of alliances between the public and the private, but there is still some need for stronger work. So maybe we have an international cooperation architecture that was designed for the problems of the last century. Maybe we have to revisit it and see how do we redesign for the challenges of the 21st century with this kind of pandemic. Someone was mentioning the role of the Security Council. Definitely, I don't know, this is an obsolete role these days, or is it something that we can still revisit? We need a functioning global economy. There is, I mean, the UN alone cannot do anything with to resolve this problem. We need peace in many of the countries, and we have this ability to maybe come together with all these sectors that we have mentioned, private, public, etc., to address those, to address those problems and come up with collective solutions. And as Ertharin mentioned, the Sustainable Development Goals and actually the Paris Agreement were very clear expressions of this global resolve to create a better, more equal and more inclusive and more sustainable future. So we should continue to stick to those ones as the goals for all of us. So I think that this is an area where we still need to work. How do we renew those international structures for cooperating at the global level, so that we are better prepared for continuing with this crisis and be ready for the next one. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Meritxell. Andrea.
Concrete steps are very interesting because in many ways you would not ask a concrete step from somebody who just had a trauma. You know, you wouldn't ask somebody who just had an accident to say, okay, now you need to heal. Well, it doesn't work that way. You know, you need to rest and you need to try to make sense of things, and sometimes sense actually comes to you. And I really want to remind everybody what happened to many when in March, April, we started looking at the sky or at the rivers, that because of the decline in production, actually they were clean again. And suddenly people say, whoa, by not doing things, we are actually making them better. And it was, whoa, it was this moment of very strange displacement. So my strong recommendation would be actually for people to just have a walk and to really have a walk and be silent with themselves and really try to see themselves in the middle of the trauma that we are all living. And if possible, start from the poorest. Start from the poor that are close to you. Because if anything made clear this pandemic, and Geoffrey was mentioning this at the beginning, how splitting, you know, the pandemic has been. But in the US, it's just heartbreaking, you know. If you are poor, you are so much more affected and devastatingly so. So I really hope that together with ecology, we will rediscover solidarity, that we will rediscover that humans are already one. My heart is like your heart. My eye is like your eye. I can be part of your body. If I die today and I am in a donor program, I can be implanted. Part of me can be implanted into any of you because we know our biology well enough to make that transition. So let's make an effort to make the transition on the cultural level, on the linguistic level, on the emotional level, on the political level, and rediscover what is already obvious to all of us, that we are already one, but we are not one at all. So the issue, I think, to me, you know, the great hero that I would like to share is actually discovered by Caroline Nordstrom. She was an anthropologist in Mozambique in '92 when peace came to Mozambique after 15 years of civil war, 1 million deaths, and so on. And she encountered fishermen that were coming from the coast up to the mountains in Mozambique, hundreds of kilometers, carrying the fish that they would never be able to sell because everybody was so poor that there was no way that anybody could buy this fish. And when she asked, but why are you doing this? They said, this is how life goes on. I like that. I like the responsibility of somebody who was native to that land, who learned from his ancestors to fish in the coast of Mozambique and was willing to do the trip to bring the fish to the people of the mountains and let the people of the mountains enjoy the fish. And it didn't really matter if he had to pass through many warring factions, Frelimo, Renamo, Frelimo, Renamo, Frelimo, Renamo. He was doing it because that was how life was going on. I really think that the pandemic is an invitation for us to realize that actually life wants to go on with us, with our help, and that we can learn from what is happening. And my final plea is actually to universities, to places like yours, David, because I really think that humanity needs space to think and needs the time to think clearly. Thinking doesn't come out of nothing. It comes out of silence, discipline, conversation.
Thank you so much, Andrea. And Ertharin, would you please have the final word for our conference?
Well, 3 quick points. First of all, 3 concrete actions. A U.S. administration that recognizes the importance of multilateral action, multi-sectoral cooperation, and global engagement. Full stop. Second, support for the UN. The opportunity for us to leverage our capacities as states, both our financial as well as our intellectual capacities, to support and address the issues that COVID has only illuminated that affect our society and our ability to create peace and prosperity and opportunity is, I think, the UN is key to us achieving those goals. And so then my third point is I must go back to my passion, which of course is food security, and remind us that we are all diplomats when it comes to food security, because all of us, 7.7 billion people, participate in the food system in one way or another. We make decisions about how we consume food, the way we consume food. We make about the clothes we wear and the products we use, and much of all of those decisions that originate in our agriculture. And the demand for more regenerative agriculture that supports the sustainability of not just our agriculture system, but our planet is quite critical, because agricultural products today are produced by some 570 million farms around the world, and they're located in developing countries, of course, but food systems, wherever they are located, are first and foremost local. And from the farm to production to logistics to the consumer to how we dispose of food is decisions that we make as individuals, that we need to think beyond our own needs and recognize in a diplomatic manner that we are performing, the decisions that we make have an impact on those that we share this planet with on a daily basis and a going forward basis. So how we operate as individuals in the food system is directly related to the sustainability of our food system for the future.
Well, this has just been such an extraordinary panel, and I just want to say that it's just been such an honor for us at the Gray School to have four such distinguished guests with us. So Ertharin Cousin, Meritxell Relaño, Andrea Bartoli, and Geoffrey Wiseman, thank you so much for not simply your contributions, but for your absolutely vital and life-changing work as diplomats. So this concludes our conference. And on behalf of the Gray School, I want to once again express my profound gratitude to everyone who has participated in this gathering, attendees, panelists, and those behind the scenes who have made this gathering possible. We look forward to hosting you all again at future conferences, and we look forward to welcoming you all here to Chicago. So to learn more about the Gray School of Applied Diplomacy, I invite you to please visit our webpage at DePaul University at depaul.edu, and you can put in the Gray School or Applied Diplomacy there at the website, and you'll be taken to our website. And so I thank you all, and in whatever time zone you are in, I wish you a safe and healthy day and week, year, and please carry on with all of your great work. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.